mental illness, mental illness, mental illness, mental services, mental illness, mental services,
resources, mental illness, 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 mental services, mental illness, mental illness, mental services, illness, mental resources, mental illness, resources, illness, resources, mental illness, mental illness, mental illness,
mental services,
mental illness, mental illness, mental illness, mental illness, mental illness,
mental illness, mental illness, mental illness, mental illness, mental illness, mental illness, mental services, mental illness,
services, illness, mental illness, services, illness, mental illness,
resources, services, and mental services. Only those who really resources.
services,
illness,
mental illness,
mental services, mental illness,
mental
Services,
illness,
mental illness,
mental
services, mental resources.
mental illness.
Alex, for our agents, players consider co-occurring. Some start with effects. Finish the tune. A train. It provides. Sam, mental services, mental illness, mental services, mental services, mental illness, mental illness resources, mental illness services, resources, mental illness services, mental services, resources, mental illness services.
mental illness, 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 mental services, mental illness, services, mental services, mental services, mental illness, mental illness, mental illness, mental services, mental illness, illness services, mental illness, mental illness, mental illness, mental illness, mental illness, mental illness, mental services, mental services, mental illness services.
treated as in services, mental services, mental
illness, resources, mental illness, mental illness, services, mental resources.